Karishma, thank you so much for that introduction. You've already done a fantastic job in introducing all the panelists. What I was thinking is that we will get all the panelists take a couple of minutes to give your thoughts on the topic that we are discussing today, and then we will start taking some questions. But before that, just wanted to kind of set the agenda. We've all heard that trade war is easy for the U.S. to win. So that's what we've been told. But is that really true? And what are the global ramifications of that? According to a report by Bloomberg Economics, uncertainty over trade could lower world gross domestic product by 0.6% in 2021. That's double the direct impact of the tariffs themselves. It's also equivalent of $585 billion of the International Monetary Fund's estimated world GDP of 97 trillion. So what are the opportunities? What are the challenges? That's what we'll discuss. I'll request Mr. Arun Kumar to first start with his initial remarks on that.
Thank you, Arijit. I want to thank everybody who's come here braving the rain. I know I have some really true friends here who made it. So good to see all of you. Let me just start with some personal reflections. So as was mentioned, I served in the Obama administration, which seemed like a really long time ago now, where I had a very senior role in the trade and commerce area. And as a part of that, I was engaged with China in a couple of different ways. One is there was a construct called the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, which was a way in which the two countries would speak to each other at multiple levels, both at the policy level down to the detailed implementation level. This took a lot of work on both sides. And the whole idea was to engage, was to have some confidence building as you got to know each other and got to know the issues and make progress. Progress was slow, but there was definite progress and there was engagement. And I know that both sides worked very hard to make sure that every time they met, there was some tangible progress. There were clearly lots of frustrations that things weren't moving fast enough, but there was engagement. And the whole climate was to figure out how to engage with each other. The second area where I was involved was in a different sense, was with the TPP, with Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an idea that the United States had pushed forward to engage a dozen countries to come to create the largest free trade area in the world. And the idea was to set the rules of trade so that others could opt into it. So although China was not part of the first round, there was no reason why China could not opt into it and join a world kind of trade order. And what was really interesting to me was that as it moved forward, I remember President Jokowi from Indonesia. And Indonesia, by any standards, very protectionist state, I would say, behind a number of countries. But he came to Washington and he said, Indonesia must join the TPP. So it was interesting to see how the idea of a free trade area that covered a large part of the planet was taking hold even in a traditional country like Indonesia. So that was very interesting to be involved in these two areas. So I just want to set the personal context because some comments we might have later might come from that. But I wanted to now go back to a bigger picture, which is the trade war. There is no question today that the biggest economic rivalry in history, at least in a couple of centuries, is playing out before us, which is the U.S.-China trade war. Now, this war actually has some historic antecedents. It is not the first trade war. Maybe one of the most spectacular trade wars, Bombay played a role in that, which was the Opium Wars. If you remember, as history will tell you, China was exporting a lot of tea, and the Brits drank a lot of tea. And as they drank more and more tea, the trade deficit grew. There was not much that Britain could send to China to cover the trade deficit. And so Britain had the only thing China wanted was silver. And there were no other British products that they cared for. And after a while, Britain felt it could not send more silver. And so then Britain had to find another product. And that product was found right here in India, which is opium. And then the Chinese, of course, the Chinese government the emperor wasn't really keen on opium. So various trade barriers came up. And the British sailed up to try to fight against those trade barriers, eventually leading to Hong Kong being ceded to the British Crown and so on and so forth. So there is a history here of trade wars. In that case, a huge surplus that China had built up, which the Imperial Britain did not like. So today we have a different trade war, where China has built up another huge surplus. At that time, China was inward-looking China. That happened despite China. I mean, remember that China had, after 1433, after Zhengzi died off the coast of Calicut, they just turned inward. They were not interested in looking outward. But it was the imperialist powers coming in and pushing. Today's China is different. They're very outward focusing. You look at the Bridge and Road Initiative, they're building connections around the world. So it's a different China, but again, China has a big trade surplus, which the US doesn't like. At this time, China is not looking for, again, the issue that China is able to give more to the US or to the rest of the world than they can give China. And what China really wants is technology, and the US is very, very particular not to hand over technology under the rules that it thinks China believes in. So that's, in a way, interesting that we are once again seeing a repeat of history. So it's not new. It's also, once again, I think the trade war reflects a clash of worldviews as well. So there's a clash of worldviews. There's an urge of national self-preservation. All of these were parts of the old trade wars as well. So in this scenario, what exactly are we seeing? I think the United States today, coming to the U.S.-China trade war, does want a new economic relationship with China. If you look beyond all the heavy talk, it wants what it wanted even under the Obama administration or previous administrations. You've got to remember that the U.S. was very keen on the economic rise of China for lots of reasons. One is that as China rose, China would become a big market for products of the U.S. The U.S. is a very export-oriented country, and incomes in the U.S. and employment in the U.S. would only go up if it can export more. So it was very important for the U.S. Hence, U.S. wanted China to be part of the WTO, sponsored China's membership of the WTO, and really felt that eventually China will play by the same set of rules as the U.S. and all things will be good. Now, I think the U.S. now feels that, well, China is not quite playing by the same set of rules. They're not quite focused on allowing us in the U.S. to expand our markets into China. So there are all these restrictions. I mean, Google can't operate in China, or there are so many U.S. tech firms that can't quite operate they want to. So the view in the U.S. is, well, this whole WTO, etc., isn't working out the way the U.S. thought it should work out. So, what's the way to change that game? And that's the context in which this is happening. There are areas where there can be mutual interests, but there's a disconnect in terms of how the U.S. sees China pursuing its interests and how China sees U.S. pursuing its interests. So that's, I think, at the bottom of it is that they both need each other, but they don't agree with the way in which they are working with each other. Now, there's another level at which both countries are kind of locked in embrace, because as China has been selling more to the U.S., all that money's been sitting in the U.S. Now there's a $1.2 trillion China dollar holding, which keeps U.S. interest rates down, which is good for the U.S. economy. So in many, many ways, both countries need each other. So it's interesting that this trade war is one in which, both countries are, at the end of the day, hurting each other. I think that's pretty clear. Hurting each other, and when elephants fight, a lot of other things get trampled, and so we're seeing a lot of hurt around the world. So let me just stop with those comments, and then we can pick it up.
Mr. Rao, why don't you speak next?
Thank you, and it's wonderful to be here at the invitation of the Asia Society and to talk about a subject which I believe is of enormous relevance, not just because it concerns two of the most powerful countries in the world, but because the impact of that, some people have called it the grandest collision in history, China and the US sparring over trade, and the impact and the fallout of that has reverberations that affect each and every one of us as countries, as economies, as markets. My own association with China goes back to the mid-1980s. I made my first visit to China in 1986, when China had just begun to open up. Of course, the reform process had begun in 1978, but it took time to accelerate, and these were still early days. China was still very Maoist, very post-Cultural Revolution, and visiting Beijing for the first time, one could hardly imagine that in 2008, just 22 years down the line, they would host the Olympics, which in many ways I think was the pinnacle of Chinese messaging to the world that they had indeed arrived. And that was followed so quickly by the financial crash of 2008 and the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And the juxtaposition of these two events, I think, tells you a lot about where China is today and where the U.S. is today. Of course, when I came to study China and to work on China, the relationship between China and the United States was very close. This was the post-Nixon period, the opening up to China, and Deng Xiaoping had embraced the Americans, and everything seemed to suggest that the Cold War years, where China, people accused the U.S. of having lost China, if you remember, in the late 1940s. Those years seemed far behind, although the Taiwan question rankled constantly, and it continues to figure in the Chinese, not only in the Chinese imagination, but in the strategic geopolitical perspective as it concerns the East China Sea and Northeast Asia, and of course it has concerns for us too, because much of our trade, a great percentage of our trade passes through those marine waters, and we can't obviously be detached from what is happening there. This period when I worked on China was also the period of our opening up to China after the 1962 conflict. As you know, the ambassadors went back to each other's countries in 1976, and that was when the period of normalization began with China. But up until 1988, when Rajiv Gandhi visited China, we really hadn't been able to craft a modus vivendi in our relations with China. And that modus vivendi was essentially worked out during that very historic visit made by our then Prime Minister to Beijing and other Chinese cities, and when Deng Xiaoping and he shook hands and spoke about the Asian century not being complete without India and China working together. Today it's called the Pacific century or the Indo-Pacific century. Some people say it's China's century. So there are many, many definitions of whose century it is. But coming to the U.S.-China relationship, what a long distance has been traversed since those years in the mid-1980s and the 1990s, that high point, as it were, in the relationship. Today, with the Trump administration in power, people often attribute the change in the US-China dynamic to the advent of President Trump. But I think it's much more than that. I think all across the political spectrum, be it whatever party in the United States, there is a certain element of disillusionment with China, that the Chinese have been bad actors. These are the words that they use, that somehow America has been shortchanged by China. And that impression and that very subjective, you may call it a subjective feeling towards China, is entrenched today in the United States. And it gave, I think, President Trump the opportunity and the kind of ecosystem in which to pitch his strategy, if you may call it. Some say it's more tactical than strategic, but certainly to pitch his whole piece on China. I think that opportunity has been provided. Now, what exactly does the trade war mean? Now, if you look at the multilateral trading system, the international trading system worldwide, I think it's very much in disarray, marked more by disagreement than by agreement, as it were. The whole concept of multilateralism in world trade is being called into question. You have more regional trading arrangements, you have free trade arrangements, you have a lot of nationalism and sovereign emotion being expressed when it comes to the whole arena of trade. Now, what happens after this? Obviously, I mean, even people in the IMF talk about the need for these matters to be resolved rather than to be played out in a fashion that tensions just mount, disagreements increase, and misunderstandings just multiply. And that seems to be the situation now, because ever since early 2018, you've had this whole question of tariffs. President Trump proudly calls himself the tariff man, and he calls out to the beauty of the trade war, as he, in his own imagination, there is something beautiful about the trade war, which is easy to win also. But are there winners and losers in this? Because it seems that, although if you talk to Peter Navarro and, the people close to President Trump, they will say, of course the Chinese are losing, of course the Chinese are hurting, America is winning, America is not affected by the tariffs, the American consumer doesn't have to pay more for, the consumer goods that you import from China. But the agricultural sector in the United States is definitely hurting. The soybean farmers are really quite disadvantaged by this turn of events. And on the Chinese side, you have President Xi Jinping and you have President Trump, both very nationalistic leaders, both wanting to make their countries great again and not being inhibited about it. And although the Chinese, one has to grant, have been quite restrained in their reactions to what the Americans are doing, but the terrain is extremely, extremely difficult. And it affects all of us because trade wars have an impact on global economic growth. It is true, you can argue that India is not so much a part of the global supply chain. China and its Southeast Asian neighbors may be a little more affected than that. But China is an important trading partner of ours. And the U.S. is an important trading partner of ours. And you've seen President Trump, of course, unleash some of his protectionism, if you may call it thus, against India. And we have been also quite restrained in our reactions, saying that we would like this settled through negotiation, that we don't want it to get out of hand, that this is a strategic partnership that we value between two democracies. And I think there is an innate affinity between India and the United States for various reasons. And that, I suppose, will be a good ballast for this relationship, whatever be the areas of difference or tension. But with China, it's very different. The rise of China and the impact it has on the United States. People talk about the Thucydides factor, whether you compare the United States to Sparta and China to Athens, and how did Sparta react to the rise of Athens, and what happened? Devastation, obviously. So there are lessons, obviously, to be learned from history.
Ambassador Rao, thank you so much. Dr. Baig.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Well, great start by Mr. Kumar and Ms. Rao. What I would like to do is tell you a few anecdotes and tidbits about trade war, which hopefully will cast today's discussion in a more amusing light than the grave matter that it is. So first and foremost, chicken tax. In 1963, the U.S. Was very fed up with agriculture access to Europe, particularly U.S. roasted chicken and frozen chicken, which had no access to Europe because the Europeans were very finicky about the quality of chicken they consumed, and they simply refused to import U.S. chicken. So the U.S. retaliated and imposed 25% tariff on European brandy and light trucks and so on. 1963, it's still there, and it's called the chicken tax. If you try to export a light truck from Europe to the U.S. today, you're still subject to that vagary of 1963 and that spat between the U.S. and Europe. The reason I'm beginning my discussion by saying this is to tell you that once you put up tariffs against a country, it will take a very brave soul as your successor to take it down, because you will immediately be accused of pandering to China's interests and surrendering. Donald Trump can be hiding in a cave writing for Breitbart, but he will make all the noise in the world saying that he used to be tough, he made America great, and his successor, whether it is Warren or Biden or whoever it is now taking the country down to the dumps. So this is why The notion that the trade war can be won quickly and resolved quickly, I think, is fundamentally wrong. It will outlast Trump for decades, if not the rest of the century. The second point is that the cost of trade war. Now, I live in Singapore, so we're in the epicenter of the global supply chain and the value chain, and we see companies bewildered by the tweet storm and the retaliations from one side to the other, and all these stories about how the supply chain is fragmenting, and countries like Vietnam are potential beneficiaries of this trade war because some factories will move there, and the Koreans and the Taiwanese will divest away from China and so on. I have two takeaways from that. Number one, you would have to be very brave to react to the trade war by moving your factory from China to Vietnam. Number one, the Chinese will not like it at all. So what you're seeing right now is companies which are extending their operations in Vietnam, but not necessarily shutting down their operations in China, because that would put them in the path of fury of the Chinese authorities. Secondly, Vietnam is small. Compared to China, the sort of economies of scale Chinese companies can offer to the rest of the world, not Vietnam, not Thailand, not Malaysia, not Mexico, nobody can match it. Who can produce 1 million cell phone displays with a 6-week notice? It's China. Nobody else, with a very high degree of precision and accuracy. So if we are going to have a breakdown of the supply chain and fragmentation of the global value chains, what we will end up getting is a far more distorted, far more inefficient supply chain, which will be susceptible to supply shocks, which will be susceptible to far greater distortion than anything that we have enjoyed over the past 2 decades. So let's look back at the past 2 decades and think of it as a golden era of the gains of globalization. Thanks to China, we've enjoyed very reasonably priced products across the spectrum. If this is going to continue, and I fear it will, get ready to pay more and get ready to have products with a little more defect than they were when they were to come basically from China. The second point is this uncertainty around this investment environment is causing a chilling effect on long-term plans for companies. If you were Siemens, you may want to target Chinese demand by setting up a company there, but do you really want to be part of the noise of whether some of your parts may be coming from the U.S. and you'd be subject to some sanction if you're going to export it? But maybe you want to wait till Trump goes, 1 or 5 years, but that means you will stop investing for the time being. So far, in the last year and a half since tariffs began, we really haven't seen any major dislocation in global consumption. It's soft, but it's not weak. We haven't seen any major problem in global liquidity. It's ample. Central banks, by and large, are doing their work to make sure that the noise and headwind coming from trade wars are offset. But at the same time, on the investment sentiment and actual investment side, we have a major malaise. And that will continue for the time being because there's absolutely no clarity. Would you dare, let's say you don't want to deal with Vietnam, would you dare put a plant in Mexico? Trump the other day threatened Mexico with tariffs on immigration-related matters. So therefore, the Pandora's box, proverbially, has been opened in such a big manner that and I think Ambassador Rao touched upon this issue, which is that the fabric of the global economy has been built around a series of multilateral arrangements over the last 60, 70 years. These are the products of the post-Second World War Bretton Woods agreements. And they have been under tension, but they are now completely fraying under the era of Trump, and which would again cause us to not be able to reap the dividends the way the East Asians did, the way the Chinese did. It will be very hard for the likes of India to follow that model. So the model of growth, model of development, everything is getting severely challenged by the ongoing trade war.
Oh, okay. Let me just kind of thank you all for the fantastic things. I think it really sets the agenda for our evening's discussion. So if I may just quickly start the discussion right now. You talked about the chicken tax, and you talked about opium. We've also had this Smoot-Hawley law in the U.S., which kind of destroyed the trade in the 1930s. Export and import from the U.S. fell drastically Do you think we can learn anything from all these previous trade wars that we've had?
Well,
Why don't you start? Yeah.
The Smoot-Hawley Act essentially was a time in the 1930s when the U.S. just raised tariffs. And by raising tariffs, it actually led to the Depression. It led to the economy shrinking. So the lesson from that at one level really is that if everybody raises tariffs, it's going to be a global Smoot-Hawley repercussion. So that's an important lesson. But I also want to pick up a couple of things on the tariff issue. So the chicken tariff thing, once you put a tariff in, you're right, it's impossible to get out of it. That is why these free trade agreements and these multilateral agreements are important. So one of the biggest benefits that the signatories of the TPP felt was they could use it to bring about change in their economies, including the United States. Because remember, the United States is a big country with different stakeholders. The TPP was resisted by some, welcomed by the others. But the fact that you could get it done would essentially create the right pressure points. So a big reason to have these free trade agreements, especially multilateral, is it creates the domestic pressures to bring about change. I just want to put that on the table. I also want to say that the U.S.-China trade war, there are some realities below it. And there are definitely realities. There are issues, for example, technology. I mean, the U.S. companies that invest significantly in technology believe that there is forced technology transfer to give access to Chinese markets. They are resisting forced technology transfer. I think at some point, every country that has investment in technology, including China, themselves will resist forced technology transfer. The other is the dominance of state-owned enterprises in China that actually distorts markets in China. I can give you one example. When I was serving in the Obama administration, we had a huge steel glut in the world. Steel prices were dropping, and China was producing a lot of steel from their state-owned enterprises. So I remember this conversation, which happened in the Forbidden City, very impressive place to go into. And Mr. Wang Yang, who's now one of the top 7 in the Chinese hierarchy. So he listened. Finally, he said, sometimes when your arm is infected, you need to amputate it. And 2 days later, the headline was 2.3 million Chinese steel workers furloughed. So the point I want to make is this conversation does have an effect. Talking to each other, engaging, will lead to points of agreement, which not everybody may notice, but there is progress addressing the real issues that that are between two countries.
Right. Dr. Baig, do you want to also take that?
Yes. So, on the steel side, it's interesting that since the early 80s to now, in the last 30-odd years, U.S. Steel sector employment is down by something like 60 or 70%. But U.S. production of steel has not changed. U.S. Steel is still making the same quantity with far fewer people, which tells you that the steel industry is just like most modern industries. It's far more capital intensive and technology intensive. So the fact that you have a lot of disaffected, laid off steel workers in Pittsburgh and in Ohio does not mean that the U.S. has sort of forsaken the steel industry. Steel industry in the U.S. is still very large. It just doesn't need as many people. And the first set of tariffs we saw a year and a half ago was on steel. There has been virtually no change in employment related to steel. So to me, this is the problem with the populist rhetoric that I will protect your jobs, I will bring jobs back on shore by putting up a tariff wall, is that it misses out on the major waves of technology that has changed the nature of jobs over the last 30 years. And this is where it seems to me that Trump is very old-fashioned. If you look at the full-page New York Times ad he took out in 1987, criticizing President Reagan for taking it easy on Japan, it's uncanny how little his rhetoric, his train of thought has changed. Nothing has changed. In that famous ad, he talks about how the whole world is laughing at us. I'm sure you've seen that phrase uttered by Trump over and over again during the campaign 2.5 years ago, and even now, that the whole world is not laughing at us anymore. Now we're respected. And the point that Trump made in that 87 ad was, again, we got to make our allies pay for the protection that we offer. It's a bit like, Sopranos mentality, I give you protection, you give me money, or else what kind of a friend are you? So that's my one point on the steel side. On tech transfer, of course, the three pillars of U.S. negotiation right now are market access, tech transfer, and cybersecurity. I think on cybersecurity, there are major concerns, and I think everybody eavesdrops on everyone in this world if they can, and therefore I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese have been trying to listen to the Americans, but the Americans have been listening to everybody else as well. And I think it's fully understandable if many Western economies refuse to buy sensitive material that are made in China because they're fearful of backdoor. I think China should do exactly the same to the countries that it doesn't consider very friendly. But what is interesting is that on forced technology transfer and market access, in my view, those issues were probably very relevant 10, 15 years ago. I really don't think China is that underconfident any longer that it fears Western competition. Do you really think if GM had unfettered access to China, we'll be seeing American cars being driven around by much greater quantity in China? No, the Chinese simply don't want to buy American cars. It's not a question of market access, it's a question of quality of the product. Apple phones are very expensive in China, much more expensive than Huawei's phones or Oppo phones. The Chinese love to buy Apple phones. So as long as I think the Americans produce good quality products, I think the Chinese would be actually keen to have those products because they're also highly aspirational. If you travel through Shanghai or Beijing, you see American brands left and right. You'll see a Tesla store and a Starbucks coffee store and Pizza Hut and so on. So it's not entirely clear to me what kind of access would satisfy the Americans. In fact, when you look at Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce surveys, U.S. companies themselves don't complain that much about market access or tech transfer. They used to. But that was, again, like I said, 10, 15 years ago. China sort of moved beyond that. And one, if you will, corroboration of China moving beyond that is the value addition China is making in the world of technology, particularly very high-end technology. If you're talking about cancer research or AI or robotics, the best and latest patents, they're coming disproportionately from China. If you look at refereed journals where newer inventions and discoveries and technologies are being written about, they're coming from Chinese researchers from around the world. So I really think that if indeed this trade war was about market access and tech transfer and cybersecurity and was restricted in those three areas, we would have a deal by now. My fear is that the notion of symbiosis between China and the U.S. is not believed by many people who are around Trump. I'm not really sure if Trump is one of them, but certainly people like Lighthizer and Navarro are. They want to decouple from China. And I think China's growing realization is that no matter what they say to the Americans, it will not be good enough. It will never bring the tariffs down. It will never take things back to where they were because the Americans will simply never trust China. And I think that's where we are now.
I think what you talked about decoupling, at this point of time, I think it's becoming quite important in the sense, we have seen that economists like yourself have been talking of a recession in the U.S. Maybe not you, but there has been, even the U.S. New York Fed has been talking about a recession in the U.S. How probable it is right now, according to you? And then I'll follow up with another question on China, but why don't you quickly answer that?
I'll make it very short because we can spend the next 30 minutes talking about that issue. Just as a simple matter of arithmetic, it is unlikely for the U.S. to have a recession next year because U.S. consumption dynamic is still very strong. Even if you believe contribution from exports and net exports and investment would be zero next year, you can still chart out a path of 1.5 to 1.7% growth for the U.S. next year, which is why, although recession probabilities have risen, they're only in the 30% range. Even the inversion of the yield curve that the Bloombergs of the world are writing on a daily basis about, they don't necessarily reflect heightened worries about recession, but rather the fact that growth is slowing in China and Europe, and there is a flight to safety, if you will, toward fixed income instrument, which is driving the shape of and the slope of the curve.
Sure. Ma'am, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to add to what Arun and Taimur said. I agree that recession is not, overhanging the situation in the United States. I think the economy isn't in such a bad place. There are enough jobs being created. Unemployment is not an issue. And, but, there is a geopolitical aspect also to this trade war. And the whole crux of the matter is, the question is, what is the future of the world with U.S. and China both in it? And what is the kind of power equation that is going to evolve between the two countries? The trade war being a symptom of this new collision course that both of them are on. And as was just said, we really don't know. There is a great deal of uncertainty about where the trade war is going and whether the Americans will be able to strike a deal. I don't believe the Chinese are unwilling to strike a deal. Knowing the Chinese from the way they negotiate, they're an extremely pragmatic lot of people. They're very tough negotiators, no doubt. I'm not denying that. But they're very pragmatic. They're looking for a deal. And that's the American way also. Normally, the Americans also are looking for a deal. It's not that they have a here I stand, here I will remain. But in the case of President Trump, I think from the mid-'80s, he's been, obsessed with this idea that the rest of the world is taking America for a ride, and it's time that, he call them out and put an end to it. So this is the kind of impasse that we are at, and which I think should concern us because we live in this region. And, both China and the United States are part of the constellation of world powers today. America is not all omnipotent. It's very clear. It's not all omnipotent today. It's still, it's true that American power undergirds the world order because in terms of the military reach, the strength of the defense apparatus of the Americans, the kind of influence that they are able to exercise in global councils, in our region itself, for right or wrong. The Chinese have not been able to step out that way. So America's profile in the world is far, far stronger than the Chinese. Now, America can build alliances. It has friends. It has alliances. China has no such, support in that sense. It has very few friends. If they were to make a movie today, we'll have three characters, President Trump, Mr. Xi, and probably the North Korean leader. I mean, that's the kind of triangulation that you're seeing in terms of who's my friend and who's my enemy. So we live in a very muddled, very difficult world at this moment, and I don't think we can think of the trade war just as something that you can isolate, it'll go away, it's just a passing storm. It is symptomatic of something far deeper.
Yeah, Dr. Baig did say that it's not going to go away. But sorry, Mr.
No, actually, I want to just re-emphasize what both of you said. I mean, you're absolutely right that these trade issues can be settled. For sure they can be settled. There is no question they can be settled. It may mean different kinds of gifts, but it's not that these are not insuperable problems. So what is really going on, and you put your finger on it, I mean, it is really a rivalry between two countries, essentially jostling for prime position. That's what's going on here. And if you look below the details of the trade war, it's the U.S. trying to say, look, I'm not going to give you technology, which might make you strong. China retaliating in some other ways. So it's a question of mistrust that's growing because fundamentally they are both looking for a certain position in the world power arrangement, which is what you touched on. I think that's really what's below all of this, whichever way you cut it.
Right. But with China now accounting for more for the global growth than ever, I think, 28% now, do you think that China's role will only increase despite the trade war?
I think so. I definitely think so. And I think, people talk of a Washington consensus and they talk of a Beijing consensus. Now, Washington, the United States, as the world's the world's most powerful democracy and the democracy with the greatest global outreach, certainly can bring together, as I said, partnerships and alliances that enable...
Would you say that China can't? Is that what you're saying?
China can't. But China is trying to do that today. China is trying to do that with the Belt and Road Initiative.
But it's not working also, right? I mean,
I don't know if it's not working because there was a study recently within the United States in one of the think tanks looking at this, this debt that China is imposing on many countries who are participants in the Belt and Road. And the conclusion that that study made was only one of the countries is really in that situation. Not all the countries that we assume are in this terrible debt trap that the Chinese have foisted on them. So there is something going on there. There is a new architecture of power that is being sought to be built by China. There's no doubt about it. But how successful they're going to be, it's going to take time. This is still a work in progress. But on the other hand, you also see the diminution of American power compared to what it was post-collapse of the Soviet Union, when people spoke of the end of history and the fact that it was just one hyperpower, as it were, as the French called them. Things have changed.
And there may also be, I think there also is different worldviews at play. So for example, and some of them are surprising, for example, in 2018 in Davos, when the U.S. was suddenly shifting inward with Trump's protectionism, China said, we are for open trade. They were the open markets people in Davos in 2018. In 2019, the message one heard from China was, you guys in the West and many other countries, you think freedom of expression is the most important. We think societal stability is the most important. So there is another worldview, and you've got to accept there is an alternative worldview. So they were pushing an interesting worldview that was at variance with the worldviews held by many others in Davos. So there's also a conflict of worldviews at play here.
So it's as much an ideological struggle as it is a commercial or economic competition, And competition, as Matt Pottinger of the U.S. administration said, competition is not a four-letter word, he said. We are going to see more and more of it between China and the United States, and it's going to be expressed in many ways, in many, many ways.
So, Ambassador Rao said earlier that U.S. is not omnipotent. The issue these days is about omniscience. You want to be able to see everything and have the knowledge about everything. That will take you converging toward omnipotence. The fact that whether a phone or a TV is made in China or Mexico or Vietnam is increasingly irrelevant, which is why I underscore the point that President Trump's basic premise is a bit old-fashioned. The world we're living in and moving into deeper is the knowledge economy. And that's where the battle for the 21st century is being fought. Can you see everything in your opponent's home? Can you track your own population to make sure that they are not breaking the law, and you have all the information so that you can assess their financial risks and the full gamut of their personality traits? And this takes me back to my earlier point that as China becomes the world leader in both research and development in the knowledge economy, and overtakes the U.S. in producing patents and products that are focused on the knowledge economy, they will care less and less about this trade surplus vis-a-vis the U.S. and whether they can make more phones in the U.S. or more TVs in the U.S. Production, by and large, is becoming automated and commoditified. It really wouldn't matter that much. So when we are talking about the decades of rivalry that lies ahead of us, which will almost certainly spill over into military dimension here and there, it again would be the fight would be about the knowledge. We have fought over opium, we have had tariffs over chicken, and we have tariffs on steel now. A few decades from now, the young people in this audience will look back and say, boy, they were really behind their times. The fight should have been about intellectual property rights and cybersecurity.
Dr. Baig, I wanted to focus a little bit on investment. You talked about it, and I think you've said earlier also the state of warfare is permanent or not is what is really worrying the global investment dynamics as well. So do you think it is permanent, and what should investors be doing at this point of time?
Well, I think of investors in two dimensions. One is the bricks and mortars investors who are setting up companies, bringing in FDI to countries around the world. And then there are my day-to-day clients, financial investors who are investing in the world of stocks and bonds and credit and FX. For the financial investors, and I'm assuming some of you are in that group, it's a challenging environment. What we normally talk about is that if you want to invest in equities, and equities tend to be a little more risky than bonds, you have to be compensated for that. This is the equity risk premium. And therefore, you will deal with the volatility, but you would get on the whole higher return over time as long as you stay on with that equity. What has happened now in this world is that because bonds are being deemed as incredibly safe products and they're increasingly yielding lower and lower yield, that premium for equities is going down. People will pay much more for stocks today than they did 10, 15, 20 years ago. And therefore, traditional valuation metrics that tend to suggest that asset markets are incredibly overvalued may well be completely wrong and sort of not relevant for the world that we're living in, where right now, as of today's count, $17.5 trillion worth of debt in the world is yielding negative. The government of Germany, right now, if it wants to go borrow in the market, it is paid by investors to borrow. Even LVMH, I can imagine there are a couple of Louis Vuitton bags in this room, is issuing debt at negative rates. So on the financial side, it's really a weird Alice in Wonderland, La La world that we're living in. Nobody who went to school to study economics studied any of this stuff. This negative rate world and zero bound and quantitative easing and helicopter money. I mean, we are making up rules as we go along, and where this ends may well be where Japan is today. That in the West, EU and US as they become more and more insular and closed, because or not because of Trump, they become like Japan, aging, slowing, lower rates of return on capital, and therefore low-yielding assets. Which, of course, makes me, on a relative basis, much more hopeful and excited about the fact that I live in Asia, where there are parts in Asia, China and Japan being the most, issues like that are becoming more and more prevalent, but in South and Southeast Asia, it's not the case. Now, that's the financial side. On the direct investment side, again, a very large subject. Let me just touch on two quick issues. One is that long before Trump came in, China was divesting away from China already. So when you think about Vietnam, China has been investing in Vietnam for a decade, not recently. China has been the largest source of FDI in Vietnam for a very long time. Similarly, countries in the region, which used to be very Western-centric in terms of investment and finding opportunities, have become far more Asia-centric. By the way, I hope everybody in this room knows that the city that I live in is the largest source of FDI in India. So this South-South movement of capital, I think, is going to be accelerated by the trade war because, access to investment in the West will become more challenging, especially for the Chinese, but even for many other countries. And as the supply chain bifurcates, there will be more opportunities in Asia. In that world of inefficiency and distortion that I talked about, still, it would require building up a new infrastructure, and everybody will get pieces and crumbs of that, and that is probably the state of play for the next couple of decades.
Yeah. Mr. Arun Kumar, at KPMG also, I'm sure you're talking to a lot of corporates about trade war and investment. What are you hearing and seeing?
I think generally there's a concern around the world about the headwinds caused by trade wars. So that's common everywhere, where that's in every country has to worry about that. That's exacerbated by the fact that for many other reasons, many countries are turning inward. I mean, look at what's happening with Brexit. Look at what happened in Germany, France, everywhere. There's an inward.
Japan, Korea.
Japan, Korea fighting among themselves for various reasons unrelated to trade, but affecting trade. So that's a major issue. I think what we need, maybe you should think about is, what does all this mean for India? Where is the opportunity for India? But I want to make one comment, though, about China, just to pick up on something you alluded to. See, in my view, the Chinese are thinking about their own situation differently. They drove their economy with exports. Now they're saying, well, we've had our people working under difficult conditions, making cheap products for the Americans and others. It's time, we're a different country now. We need to be building better products. Our people need to live better. Let's build higher value-added products for our own people. So they're investing heavily in technology, in AI, and so forth. So I think the Chinese attitude to what they want to do has also changed in commensurate with the growth of the economy, the growth of of per capita income. Per capita income is like $16,000, and so forth. So things are changing, even the Chinese mindset. I don't think they're so keen. I wouldn't imagine they're so keen to be dependent so much on exports to the West of cheap products. So That's a big change. Now, in all this, where does India figure? What should India be? Should India follow the old Chinese model, saying, okay, let's get the stuff that they were making, make it here? Or should India chart a new path? And each of these has different implications. It's worth talking about.
I'm going to ask you that question, but first I want to ask Ambassador Rao about India. Do you think we have the structures in place to kind of tap into the global value chain that's been disrupted so badly?
Well, I think we're still getting there. And I think Arun raised a very important point. And, we've been discussing the U.S.-China matrix and all the implications that arise out of the trade war. But what's in it for India? What are the implications for India? Are we just caught in this maelstrom and, not knowing what direction the wind will blow? Or do we have a strategy? Do we have a business and trade strategy?
Do we actually have a strategy?
That's the question. I'd like to... It's still, I think, especially we talk about the make in India. We spoke about manufacturing. We identified key areas where we would create that manufacturing revolution. And 5 years down the line, it's time to review, what has been achieved or what needs to be done. Because as Paul Krugman, I think, said when he came here, you need a strategic plan for manufacturing. It's not just about adding a job here or a plant here or, as you said, getting a Chinese company manufacturing shirts to India or toys to India. I mean, all that is very well. It creates jobs. But if you look at China 2025, the agenda that they have, about innovation, about robotics, about artificial intelligence, about technology, I mean, this is a country that has already decided there is some element like the Americans had manifest destiny in the 1870s. Today, China is seized with that sense of manifest destiny. Are we seized, I often wonder, of that, with that spirit? Because we are going to rub up against China. Everybody, of course, 10 years ago, people talked about Chindia. Nobody talks about it today.
Right.
So something has happened. The Chinese have leapfrogged. We are where the Chinese were in 2003, perhaps. Kind of 15, 16 years behind them. Of course, the reform gap is there. We started much later than them. There is a trade gap. There is a technology gap. There is an innovation gap. I think this is what should keep our policymakers awake at 3 a.m. I really think this is the 3 a.m. factor that India should be seized of.
We'll go to the Q&A from the audience, but Dr. Baig first, please.
I think that Governor Rajan, former Governor Rajan, epitomized what India's strategy should be on this issue, which is make for India. Growing through an export-led model at 8-9% rate, just forget about it. It's just not going to happen in the world that we are in right now. It's just not going to happen. And anytime India tries to have an export-led manufacturing strategy, it will run into severe competition and handicap because, again, as Ambassador Rao said, it's a very long lag between India and the South and Southeast Asian economies. But it's a billion-plus economy. People here alone consume tens of billions of dollars worth of electronics products and automobiles and full gamut of manufactured and processed goods. So all manufacturers in the world should be looking at India because of GST reforms and its common market and its improving infrastructure, that they should be building it here, which is cheaper. But to do all that, I think first and foremost, there has to be an economy that has not just better physical infrastructure, but also better knowledge infrastructure in terms of skilled workforce and people who will work in factories in a fairly uncompromising manner. If you have Netflix, I highly recommend you watch this documentary called An American Factory that came out a couple of weeks ago. It's a story of a Chinese glass manufacturing plant coming to Dayton, Ohio, and setting up a branch, and how difficult American workers find to match the work ethics of Chinese counterparts, to work for 7 days a week, getting 2 off days in a month, and not ever even entertaining the thought of an overtime. Americans simply cannot do it. Can Indians match that sort of work ethic of the Chinese, or should India sort of forget about all that and harness technology to come up with better value-added jobs? And I think this is where the necessity of having people who are very well-versed in the ongoing seismic changes in the global economy to be at the helm is important.
In fact, Professor Graham Allison of the Kennedy School at Harvard tells a story that when he looks out of the window of his office, there's a bridge across the Charles River in Cambridge connecting Harvard with MIT. And it was to be renovated, and the Cambridge City Council and the city authorities were engaged on that project. And it was to start in 2014, and it still hasn't been completed. A similar bridge was being renovated in Beijing, and a bridge with many lanes of traffic. And he says, I mean, it may be apocryphal, the story, but this is what he says. The work was completed in, guess how much time? You won't guess it. 43 hours. 43 hours. So, that's what we are up against.
True. I think we'll open up for questions. If I may, sorry.
Yes, may I?
Yeah, please, the Chinese.
Good evening to everybody. Wonderful panel. Our distinguished ambassador, Ambassador Ro, and the friend, you all traveled so much, U.S., China, India. In fact, after listening, I feel you really speak a very good story about Asia. And also, I want to introduce, I'm the Chinese Consul General in town, so I thought that everybody might be interested in what is he thinking about this panel. So I just want to tell you the truth. I feel very comfortable hearing these, this distinguished panel talking about these very down-to-earth matter and very in-depth knowledge about China, U.S., about India, and also the macro picture and the growing trend. So I just want to set this right in the beginning. Feel very comfortable. Why? Because I think I'm sitting in Asia. I'm sitting, especially tonight, at the BSE building, the economic hub. It really shows that when you are in the economics, when you are down to earth, you know, when you are really responsible, you know how to work your way out. So that's my first point. And of course, Asia Society. I've been working with Asia Society for a long time. Also, since I also served in USA at the time. We worked very well with Asia Society. I was, in fact, saying, I hope one day we have our own Asia Society in China. Similar organization, similar illuminating discussion like this, I think that's something I will also come up to later. So that's my first impression. I want to tell everybody, very comfortable. I think we are down to earth, we are very pragmatic. Secondly, because in my government position, I have to very briefly also here to share with you, everybody is very familiar, our position, government position on the U.S.-China-U.S. trade dispute. I think to put it more correctly, in fact, the recent British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, put it more correctly. He said that we want to trade peace instead of trade war. So in our government, we don't want trade war. We want, as I said, we wanted to have sober-minded, pragmatic, and responsible discussions. And I'm glad also everybody is aware that the process is going on. Our chief representative, Chinese vice premier, and U.S. representative spoke recently. So we are very much looking forward to those discussions. And again, second, point for the government position would be that we are not afraid of any threatening or any trade bullying. So that's something also has been also very much I think stipulated in various government positions. So these 2 points, I think our panel have also touched upon that. And so certainly on my personal note, I also want to share with you my personal involvement in the China-U.S. trade in my earlier career. As I said, I was involved in the, I want to share the story with everybody. I was also involved earlier in the China-U.S. bilateral WTO. Originally it was, we call it MFN, Most Favored Trade or Nation Status negotiation. It took us 13 years for that kind of negotiation. And finally, to close the deal, I think it was during our Premier Zhu Rongji's visit to Washington, very close to the deal. But unfortunately, certain, political forces didn't like it, so we did not get the deal. But next year, negotiations resumed, and then we, I think, signed the bilateral in 1999. Premier Zhu's visit was 1998. So these really being through that process after 13 years, and also with a state visit to Washington without the deal. Those dramatic developments. I think history is something always a teacher. We don't want people to really be traumatized through that process, but if it is necessary, I hope history can provide a good lesson. And that agreement, China-U.S. bilateral WTO accession agreement, I think leveled the ground for nearly 20 years of cooperation and growth. And now it looks like we are coming into a new time, and we need to navigate these waters carefully, so that I hope after these negotiations, on a personal note, I hope that we set a ground for another relatively decade of stable growth, not only for our two countries, but for the world. And finally, another point I also want to make is that on a more kind of academic level, right? Because I'm really impressed. I hope, as I said in the beginning, I hope we have an Asia Society, I hope we have distinguished panel speakers like this from China. We need to tell the story of China's growth. I feel that everybody talk about the growth of China. We have, I think, being here for more than 1 year, I feel, 1.5 years, I feel our Indian friends, all very good storytellers. That's why I think Bollywood movie is more popular in China. So I hope we need to, in China, we Chinese, I sometimes say, we hear our business, our manufacturers here in India, they always say, we know how to get things done, but we don't just know how to tell the story well. So in this case, I think we need to really need to listen carefully, and also to, I think, need to engage in cooperation with our neighboring countries, especially Asia, on a just more geographical note. I think Ambassador mentioned really the rise of, essentially, how people look at the rise of China and actually the rise of Asia, the Asian century. So I think we need to, in a sense, tell the story well together. It is our civilization, Indian civilization, there is always a belief of great or grand cycles. In a sense, the cycle is now for Asia, for countries like China, India, and I also think Japan mentioned here. So that's my brief comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Can I request you to please identify yourself and keep the question short?
I'm Mudit Jain, a businessman. Very interesting discussion. Question is that former Ambassador Rao said, to be in the pole position is a war of egos. Who do you think will be in that position by the end of the next decade, given that China is in Asia, which is more populous and can exert greater influence?
Well, the predictions are that China will be that. But, you know, who can really predict the way the world goes? It's, you know, I think it'll be difficult to really put out a picture that is absolutely accurate. But I think what we all have to contend with is that China has arrived. It's not a question of rise or emergence. You know, they are here. And, it's as if the Napoleonic prediction came true, that, they will shake the world, as it were. And how are we going to determine how we make those adjustments, first of all, and how we relate to it, and how we deal with it, most importantly. And that's where, the question of the partnerships that we build up as a country, as a democracy, as an equally, promising economy with that potential to be among the frontline leaders, economy-wise, in the world. and also as a leading power, where are we headed? And what are the kinds of, not alliances, but partnerships and relationships that we build up, whether it's with the United States, whether it's Japan, whether it's Australia, whether it's countries like Singapore and Vietnam. You know, when the Singaporeans take an independent stand on something concerning China, the Chinese get very furious because they obviously think Singapore is that Chinese haven, as it were, but it's not. Singapore is a much respected member of the international community, and they have an independent point of view, which I think all of us should uphold and be supporters of. So these are the relationships that we should specially cultivate. And in our own neighborhood, I think we should pay a little more attention to our own neighbors and to see how we can build relationships that are much more equitable and where fairness and where flexibility and the idea of a commons, as it were, is built up, more collaboration, more resilience, more, those are the things we should look at, just as we must worry about the state of the multilateral trading system. Where is the WTO today? Apart from the dispute resolution mechanism, which everybody goes and, knocks on the doors of, even the people who have RTAs and free trade agreements think that, the legal dispensation that the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO offers is the best. But otherwise, where is the WTO? It really needs to be rejuvenated, and India particularly should be concerned about that. Because China had a lead on us, they took advantage of it as soon as they entered the WTO in the early 2000s, and they grew and they prospered and they are where they are. But where are we? We have to take it, we can't be left out. We need that multilateral trading system. We need free trade. We need less insularity. We need to benefit from globalization. The story is not finished.
Can I just make one point on a slight tangent, but it's related to your question? Please stop obsessing over GDP. As somebody who advised countries on national accounts for the IMF for years, I can assure you GDP is largely nonsense. It's an unseen, unknowable number that we try to approximate to come up with a sense of all the goods and services that value addition took place in an economy. It is irrelevant. So who has higher GDP than the other, and whether India is growing by 5% or 4.5%, let us who on a day-to-day basis, trade on that number, worry about it. It is completely irrelevant on the place of an economy, of a nation on the global landscape. Would you rather have 9% growth like China has had with terrible environmental degradation, or would you like to have 5% growth with good quality and good institutions? And even that 5 versus 9 measurement, I assure you, the margin of error around those measurements are between 2 and 3 percentage points in each direction. So stop talking about GDP and what that means and who's going to be number one and who's number two.
Would you also like to get China's growth in per capita income?
Right.
What they've shown over the last 20 years, 30 years, would we like to see that? Absolutely, we would like to see that.
Correct. So the thing is that it's an issue of purchasing capacity. And by that measure, China is already the number one economy in the world. If you look at Starbucks, biggest market in the world, China. If you look at Tesla's future plans, biggest market in the world, China. I met with Walmart Global Sourcing, one of the largest companies of America. Biggest expectation of demand is China. So yes, if you want to measure from a company's perspective, what is the purchasing power of an economy, you can do market surveys and figure out what is the income of those people. But that has nothing to do with GDP, which is gross domestic product. Then we're basically talking about gross national income on a per capita basis. Now it's getting technical. I'm just going to stop right there. But my only beseechment to this crowd today is that, by and large, we as economists have served you very poorly by getting you fixated on gross domestic product.
But there's a question, I think, when it's, I'm not an economist, so I can hardly, hold forth on GDP. But as a public servant who's worked in the public space, and when you look at the expanse of what challenges we face in India, and the question of lifting people out of poverty. Now, you see where China was in 1978. 1 out of 2 Chinese lived below the poverty line. Today, about 1 or 2 out of 100 live below the poverty line. So obviously, the prosperity and the growth that you generate lifts people up, lifts people out of poverty, provides them with rising expectations, more aspirations, which is happening in India. We have also lifted millions out of poverty. But that task is, I believe, helped by the more that you're able to generate in terms of your output.
But will the trade war kind of put an end to such a growth like China? Will any other country see that kind of growth? You want to take
See,
that?
I think that there are some other areas to focus on as well. For example, there is the RCEP, which is trying to create a new free trade or preferred trade zone, which includes China, Japan, the ASEAN countries, Australia. Now that is, in my view, a very positive step, where you create a larger trade zone where there can be free flow of trade in this region. That would help, in my view, all the economies. So there are things like that you can look at, and that's happening. So I think we should also remember that there are some good things happening, although at a slow pace. So while we read about the U.S.-China trade war, well, RCEP, the people working on RCEP want to conclude a treaty. They want to do it fairly soon. It's been percolating for a while, but now they're at the point where they're saying, look, we're going to get it done. There's the TPP, which is TPP minus the United States. That's moving forward as well. So there are things happening on the trade front that are not as dismal as the trade war that we see.
But it's going to destroy the multilateral system.
Right.
And we have to reflect a little about that.
And actually there the question is, does a country like India, big and powerful as she will be, become a part of a system that helps to lay that out? Like, the US tried with TPP, China with RCEP, or will it get diluted with 150 people? That is the reality of the challenge in my view.
We had a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka in 2000. And the effect of that in Sri Lanka, it's a cause for very, very polarizing debate. They feel that they didn't get the benefit out of it. So there is a story to be told about regional trading arrangements and free trade arrangements.
Versus multilateralism.
Yeah, they're very, very transient in some ways.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. This is Dilip Mehta. Absolute pleasure and feeling truly enlightened being part of here. Thanks to Asia Society. And Ambassador Rao, it was wonderful to see you here once again when I met you along with Joe Biden when you were here at the same venue. I have two small questions. One, to the panel, how do you see the growth of Vietnam taking advantage of this situation? And is it true that Vietnam has been able to grow in terms of their exports from Vietnam to US by 20% in last 1 year? Second question is as to what is the perspective of the implications and snowballing effect on India of the US-China war, notwithstanding rupee inching at 73 as we talk today. Thank you.
Dr. Baig, do you want to take that?
Okay, so let's start with the rupee and then I'll go to Vietnam. 5-6 years ago, if you estimated the relationship between the day-to-day movement of the rupee and the RMB, zero. It didn't matter what happened in China. 5-6 years ago, not 10 years ago. Today, and at that time, on a day-to-day basis, the high-frequency correlation between the rupee and the US dollar was almost 1-for-1. News, good or bad out of the US, stock market in the US, immediate impact on India. Today, that 1-to-1 has come down to 0.66, and that 0, vis-a-vis the CNY, has gone to 0.3. So the fact that the RMB has depreciated through the course of this year is having also an additional problem for the rupee. That regionally speaking, now the depreciation pressure faced by China is now spilling over to Southeast Asia as well as on India. Because normally, given how low oil prices are, rupee should be having a great time, but it's not. On the issue of Vietnam, I think I said this earlier, long before Trump came into the picture, Vietnam was seen as a very attractive place for China to offshore some of its manufacturing. On the garment side, Bangladesh has been a very big beneficiary. On the non-clothing side, like shoes and low value-added electronics, Vietnam has been a massive beneficiary. The experience of companies working in Vietnam is the following. They find the Vietnamese very hardworking. Just like the same way I said that the Netflix movie about the Chinese workers working with 2 days off in a month, they'll do the same. And they also find them not subject to a great deal of transition, attrition. They don't leave. You can train some people, they'll stay in the company for a couple of years, and that's what those multinationals want. So for the Koreans and the Japanese, Vietnam has been a great place. Increasingly, Taiwanese are coming into Vietnam, but they're all running into the other issue that I said earlier, which is Vietnam is small compared to China. You can't really build a company that matches the scale of China. Therefore, you will not be able to have the economies of scale that you saw in China. And at this moment, I think the most overzealous customs and U.S. Commerce Department officials in the world are all congregating in Vietnam. They're checking consignments from Vietnam to the U.S. to see whether made in China goods are being rerouted through Vietnam or not. So don't expect Trump to ignore Vietnam entirely. It's also a nominally speaking communist country. America has no love affair with Vietnam. Vietnam may be benefiting right now, but one tweet away from getting in trouble.
But I just have to say, it's interesting about Vietnam because I went to Vietnam a couple of times in my U.S. government role. One thing I noticed was that Vietnam's exports to the U.S. grew at 10 times the rate of U.S.'s exports to Vietnam. So they're a very aggressive country. I think it's a story of execution. They're very, very focused on execution. They pick what they want to do, and they do a really good job of it. The second thing is, guess which is the most popular country in Vietnam? Which is the country they admire the most? Any guesses? By a wide margin. By a wide margin. And I asked people, how can this be? This war was fought here, which they call the American War. They said, that's old history. We want new things now. It is the number one. Like 95% of the people would say America is the number one. And of course, also they have issues because of the Spratly Islands and the Chinese drilling, etc. So there's a visceral reaction to that, which helps other people.
Yes, that's my question. Good evening to the panel, and I'd like to thank you for your very rich insights. I am a former student of economics and currently preparing for a career in public service. My question to you is, when you look at U.S., China, and the current trade war that is transpiring in front of us, what does it mean for development policy for all the governments around the world? Because we have somebody like Donald Trump who's clearly rejected Obamacare and Medicare, and also has pulled out of the Paris Accord. And at the same time, we have countries like India who are rolling out a universal basic income, and they're also investing in a national health insurance scheme. So what is this, the entire sequence of events that transpires into a global trade war, what does it mean for developmental policy?
So just you're saying what is the implication of the global trade war on development policy, right? Yeah. Mr. Rao, you want to take that?
Well, I think development is the hard truth, as Deng Xiaoping said. Trade or no trade, although the contribution of trade to a country's prosperity may go up, as it has with India over the last 2 decades. But that you cannot obviously ignore your priorities as far as development is concerned. What kind of development can you learn from other countries? You try and learn, obviously, best practices from countries that are more or less in the category that you would call developing, that you would call faced with similar challenges. You obviously try and exchange ideas with them and create, new approaches to the challenges that you face. A lot of our civil servants go to the United States, to the Ivy League universities to be trained in mid-career programs, and obviously things like the art of negotiation or meeting with counterparts from Latin America, for instance, or Africa. The United States very often becomes that kind of meeting ground, especially for people who are not in the diplomatic service but who work in the field of development here in India.
And trade war really doesn't have an impact
I
on
don't
that,
believe trade war really has any implication.
But just to soothe your concern, the most...
So can we just let him answer that, then we'll come Sorry.
I just wanted to tell you that the most exciting work on development economics right now is being done by basically 2 Indians sitting in the U.S. MIT's Abhijit Banerjee and Harvard's Raj Chetty. And in fact, on the universal basic income, big-scale experiments are being done in Texas where they're identifying women who have substantial needs and all being given $1,000 a month, and the data is being collected to see how their day-to-day lives change by just getting this transfer of income. And as the U.S. campaign takes shape in the coming year, you better be sure that every single Democratic candidate would have one way or the other a UBI plan. So U.S. is by no means behind, both in terms of developing ideas on the developing economic side, as well as concern for policy. Also on Medicare and Medicaid, Trump has not gone anti-Medicare and Medicaid. He's anti-Obamacare. He's anti-everything Obama stands for. But at the same time, as far as prescription drug coverage in the U.S. is concerned, it's actually gotten better over the last 4 years. And the Medicaid for All slogan that we hear more and more from the Democrats, the Republicans will not be able to walk away from that. So U.S. is not walking away from these ideas.
Mr. Kumar, you want to say something?
No, I want to say that we mustn't forget the fact that we have a huge domestic economy, a huge domestic market. And one of the ways in which we're going to see uplift is through entrepreneurship. It's not going to be the old age of large corporations hiring lots of people, because as was mentioned, the large corporations are hiring fewer people because of automation. But there are many, many industries, service industries, agricultural processing, and so forth. So we're going to see, entrepreneurship is going to be a key driver. And I think many of the policies that the government has put out recognizes the fact that entrepreneurship has to be a key driver.
Thanks. Okay, I think we are absolutely running out of questions. Okay, one question? No? One. Let's have you. Fine. One last question.
Need a mic?
Sorry, I was late. I got held up in the rain center traffic. Good evening. I'm Apurva Parekh. I just wanted to find out, when we had Mahatma Gandhi's movement about Swadeshi, and our Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi speaking about Make in India. So when we have such, emphasizing upon that, does it impact the production of this China or other countries, because India wants to be self-sufficient and tries to do it on its own? So I wanted to have your view on that. And the second thing, the terrorism which we see from one country, which impairs the normal peace relationship, and that also affects the global economy, because then there are this wars against tariffs and everything. So I wanted to have your views on this.
The situation in India, the Make in India, how will it impact China? Is that what your question was?
I think that Chinese companies are very interested in what Raghuram Rajan had said, make for India, that they're not keen on making things to use India as an export base, but India's market is large enough that not just the Chinese, the whole world would be happy to come and make in India for India. And even if we're looking at a world beset with trade war-related frictions and walls going up, proverbially and literally, we will still have opportunities in countries that have large domestic economies, and India certainly is number one in that regard.
Any last comments?
And
I think we'll answer that question right now. I think we're really out of time right now.
I think we didn't talk too much about the imperatives of the India-China relationship. All of you realize that China is a next-door neighbor, and we have a 3,500 kilometer long unsettled border with China. We have to be able to deal with China and create a modus vivendi. The modus vivendi that was crafted as a result of the Rajiv Gandhi visit, that has started fraying at the ends. And we have to think of new ways of engaging each other and building a relationship for the future. And all this issue of technology, innovation, closing the information gap. The Consul General spoke about Indian movies in China, but Indian movies don't tell you everything about India, There's a huge information gap about India in China, and likewise about China in India.
Do you want to end it?
Yeah, so let me suggest that while we talked about the U.S.-China trade war, the U.S.-India trade situation is actually good news. Even though you've got Trump saying tariff king and this and that, the fact on the ground is that trade has grown by almost 50% in the last 4 years. U.S. companies and Indian companies are doing increasing amount of business with each other. So I thought we should end on a good note. The good note is, while all that's going on in both the U.S.-India relationship in terms of trade is definitely on the up.
And if you want more Harley Davidsons from the U.S. in India, we'd like to send more Royal Enfields to the United States.
Only 10 of them are bought in India anyway.
Dr. Baig, Ambassador Rao, Mr. Arun Kumar, thank you so much. I think it has been really fun-filled evening. I wish we could take more questions. I had a lot of more questions, but we are out of time now. Thank you again. Thank you so much.